Greetings friends and welcome back to our digital workflow. In this episode, we're going to let Lightroom automatically generate a panoramic image using a multitude of pictures. It's actually a very fun and easy technique, so let's jump right in. All right friends, welcome back to yet another lesson in Lightroom. Let's jump right in. Now, as you can see, we are still here in our beautiful Misty Aspen forest. I was somehow lucky enough to be out early in the morning when this massive fog rolled across the woods and we just had this insane, mysterious fog penetrating our entire scene. This is a little bit rare for Colorado considering that we do have a mostly arid climate, so getting things like clouds and fog to really saturate and submerge our forest is a bit of a rarity for us. So this, I think, is going to be a nice treat. Let's back out and take a look at what we've got. Now, before we really launch into this episode, I understand that we've been doing a lot of high-end photo retouching thus far. We've been using multiple RAW files to create super RAW files. We've been going in and hand painting panoramics in Photoshop. And for any of you who really enjoy the kind of tedious work like I do, that's all well and good. But I do understand that there are a great many photographers out there who just want a quick and easy workflow that will help to bring out the life and the vibrance in your images and not keep you sitting in your office for hours on end. So with that in mind, we're going to use this opportunity to make a pretty quick little lightning episode here that should get us through this workflow very, very quickly. We will only be using Lightroom. There's no need to go into Photoshop. Lightroom is actually going to be perfectly fine for photo merging our images into a nice looking panoramic file. And then we're going to use a development module to do some fine tuning. And after that, the image will be done, ready to go. So let's get started. As you can see over here on the left, I have once again bracketed my images because I'm neurotic about that. So we start from dark, and as we move across, we get a little bit brighter as our brackets go. This is also a panorama, so each one of these rows is a freshly bracketed panoramic row. We have 4 rows, so ultimately we're going to have 4 pictures out of these 20 original images that we will use to make our nice, beautiful panoramic image. Now again, because the light was nice and soft and even, I don't think that we need to get in here and create multiple RAW files for this. I think we're going to be able to pull this off with just a single RAW file out of each row. And for the most part, I'm going to go right down the middle. Let's take a look right here. So typically when we're shooting images in brackets, we have our 2 dark images on the left. We have a center image, which should be properly exposed for all intents and purposes. And then to the right, we have 2 brighter images that should be slightly overexposed. Now for each of these kind of woodland scenes, I'm going to pretty much select the image that goes right down the middle. So let's get a look at that. Here we have dark, a little less dark. Here is our middle shot out of our 5 brackets. I'm going to hit the B key and send that image to the quick collection. A little bit brighter and way too bright. These are both looking a little overexposed, so let's move on to our next panoramic panel. And again, right down the middle, that looks like a really darn good exposure to me. The light is nice and flat and soft. B to send that to our quick collection. Over to our next panoramic panel. Again, right down the middle, I'm going to hit the B key. That looks pretty darn good. Over to our next panoramic panel. Once again, right down the middle, our center exposure is going to be the winning shot. All right, so out of 20 files that we shot on location, we're only going to be using 4 to build out our beautiful panoramic image. And as you can see, you can kind of start to see it taking shape already. We have pretty consistent exposure continuity between each of these files. So let's go ahead and select all of these, right click, go down to Photo Merge, and let's let Lightroom create a panoramic for us. All right, so our little dialog box comes up. Lightroom is of course doing a little bit of manipulation, some kind of bending and twisting in order to get these files to match up beautifully. And you can tell by this sort of boundary out here where things are getting a little wonky. But again, that's okay. We grab our boundary warp tool, slide that to the right, and Lightroom just kind of smushes all of this stuff out so it fills the screen beautifully. All right, I don't need to do any of this other stuff. No automation is necessary. So let's just hit merge and we will let Lightroom go to work for us. All right, now once Lightroom finishes with its automatic process, we can see originally here is 1, 3, 4, and 5, these are our original raw files, and Lightroom has used those raw assets to create this beautiful panoramic scene that is wedged right in between everything else. Let's double click this guy and get a closer look. All right, so we can now see how that our forest has kind of come to life. We have this beautiful sort of misty, mythical, surreal forest, and it's already looking really good with very minimal work. I think we're pretty much ready to jump into the development module and start making a few creative adjustments. Now, again, in the interest of saving time, the first thing I notice is this big exposure blob over here on the left. Basically, I just kind of added a little extra room on the left-hand side in order to complete my scene. I never really thought that I would need that, and as you can see, it basically creates this giant white blob that leads the viewer directly out of the image. So we don't want to allow the viewer to leave the image over here. So rather than going in and patching this up with extra trees in order to preserve all of the extra pixels that we so painstakingly shot, we're just going to crop this out. So let's grab our crop tool, and I'm just going to come over here and move over to where I'm basically looking at nothing but forest right up here. I don't want to have any sky, and I don't want to have any exposure burnouts. So let's just hit the return key and crop that right on out of there. Not a big deal, moving right along. Okay, now we do still have our forest, but now I'm looking over on this right-hand side, and we have a lot of evergreen trees over here that are creating a very sort of dark compositional blob on the right-hand side. This is a little bit distracting. It's kind of creating a heavy anchor on this end of the frame. So once again, let's just quickly crop that out as well. Right about there. So all we're really left to focus on is this sort of beautiful, mysterious aspen forest. We have lots of juvenile trees kind of growing up over here. We have lots more mature trees kind of coming up on this side of the scene. And then again, we have lots of these beautiful, beautiful spruce trees that are just kind of growing up throughout our scene all across the center here. And again, there's also this really beautiful, mysterious fog that's completely filling the entire forest. So we have ourselves a very kind of picturesque, tiny little mysterious snapshot of the forest. Now we're ready for a couple of creative edits. So the first thing that I'm going to do, and the first edit that I usually like to do when I'm working with aspen trees, is to get my color temperature properly dialed in. Right now, again, there is a lot of yellow leaves all around here. And as the sunlight comes through and it hits these yellow leaves, it starts bouncing all around the entire forest, and it creates lots of very yellow ambient light. Now that yellow light is less prominent here in the morning, but it's still there just a little bit. And as soon as we correct our color temperature, you will see just how much yellow there is. So let's grab our medicine dropper. Now this is actually Lightroom's automatic white balance tool. And the way this works is you go into your scene and you hover over a portion of the color in your scene that should have what you consider to be a neutral white or gray. And what Lightroom will do is when I click on this, Lightroom will automatically attenuate my color temperature and my tint so that we do in fact have a perfect neutral white. So now all of my aspen trunks are beautifully white rather than having that initial yellow tinge like they did before. So we've also kind of cooled the whole scene down, and we've really exemplified the fact that this forest is full of this beautiful, mysterious fog. All right, next, let's start in with some large format edits. I'm going to begin with exposure. I'm just going to bring this up 0.3 to give our scene a little bit of overall brightness. And as we go through, I'm going to come down. Highlights are going to come down just a tiny little bit. As you can see, we've got some highlights that are really starting to burn their way out along the top of the frame there. If I move this all the way to the right, I lose a lot of information along the top of the scene here. If I move it all the way to the left, I start to gain some of those trees back. I don't like to pull my highlights all the way down to 100%, so let's just make it about, call it 60, and that looks pretty good. Shadows can come down just a tiny little bit. I want to start to celebrate the sort of contrasty darkness in these beautiful spruce trees. Whites can actually go up just a little bit. That should bring our aspen trunks up a little bit. Blacks can go down, and essentially we've just created a little bit of a natural contrast in our image. Now this is early in the morning, we don't have broad sunlight on us just yet, so as a result, the colors in the scene are relatively subdued. So we'll need to add a little bit of color. Again, I'm going to go with 10 points on vibrance and color. And I will always use this opportunity to say, do not ratchet your color slider all the way to the right. I know that might look cool, or interesting or artistic, but trust me, it's none of those things. So take it easy on color saturation. Let's actually bring this all the way back. We'll even go crazy and go with 16 points of color saturation. All right, moving down into our tonal curve, I want to give this a little bit of a contrasty curve. So let's just come in here and we'll call this, we'll do a little extra here because this is kind of a mysterious artistic looking scene. So I'm going to go with +8 on my highlights, we'll go with +6 on my lights, and then we'll go down to maybe a -5 on our darks and a -6 on our shadows. Again, that's creating a little bit of an S curve through here, through our tonal curves, and it's adding just another subtle, natural bit of contrast into our scene. All right, let's roll back up and maybe see about putting a couple of local edits into this. I'm looking over here, and once again, I'm seeing that this area, I don't want to say that it's becoming problematic because it's just sort of shrouded in fog, but I want to make sure that I don't have this sort of dull white kind of loss of color up here in this section. So I'm going to start off with a graduated neutral density filter, and I'm going to drag us kind of over here in this region to sort of address this corner up here. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to actually warm that up. I'm seeing some yellow trees over here, and where there are yellow trees, we might be able to get a little bit of yellow fog, a little bit of warm light into that misty fog. So let's just see what happens when we bring our color temperature up just a little bit right through there. That looks nice. Maybe we'll bring our highlights down just a little bit more, and that will help to kind of mitigate some of the highlights that are easily burning out over in that portion of the image. Let's bring this guy down just a little bit more to kind of help that edit balance out. And already we've got this nice sort of beautiful orange swath up here in the corner to try and help balance out this enormous amount of color that we're seeing down here in these little juvenile aspens. All right, so I'm kind of noticing some greens, some misty greens up in this top right corner. So in order to maybe celebrate that, let's grab ourselves a circular neutral density filter, and we'll kind of come roughly into this corner here. And I'm just gonna drop the color temperature down here just a little bit and ease back on my tint just a little bit, and maybe even come down on my highlights as well up through here. Let's see here. If I go all the way down, that's a pretty good edit, but I don't want to go all the way. So let's drop our highlights and maybe even our exposure just a tad, just a couple of points to kind of put a little bit more power back into that corner because it was looking a little bit burned out to me. All right, so that's another good edit. Let's close up this panel. And so we're going to actually drop into another slider that we haven't really talked about much up until now, and that is the clarity slider. Now the clarity slider basically creates, I don't want to call it artificial contrast, but it does sort of look for areas of high contrast and it increases that contrast. And in doing so, it tends to mitigate some of this sort of fog that we have here in the forest. I like the fog. It's beautiful, it is mysterious, but it's kind of obstructing some of the trees in the scene. And so if we grab our clarity slider and we kind of add a few points of clarity, I'm going to move it all the way to the right, you can see that the fog almost completely disappears, and I'm looking at more kind of a contrasty aspen forest. Now this edit is definitely overdoing things, so we don't want to go that far, but I don't know, let's maybe try something like 25 points of clarity in our system, and that will really help us to cut down just a tiny little bit of that fog without completely overdoing it. All right, so now that we have in fact created a bunch of our initial edits, I'd like to go down and probably try to add a little bit of separation out of our green and yellow color matrix. Again, these modern camera sensors, they tend to pump a lot of yellow into the actual greens. So this green up here and this green over here and this green all throughout the center of the scene here is all comprised very heavily of lots of yellow in the color spectrum. So I can kind of come down here, I'm in my hue tab, I can target my greens, and if I slide my greens all the way to the right, you can see that I'm effectively adding kind of a lot of teal and tea-berry into my greens, thus separating them far away from the actual yellows. As I come back down towards the center, the green kind of takes on more of a yellowish tone, and it's therefore not providing as much color separation. I love that this forest is 1 part green and 1 part yellow. It gives us a lot of color variety, which is a really wonderful thing to have in your image. So let's just punch that up a little bit. I want to kind of add some separation, some color separation between my greens and my yellows, but I don't want to overdo it. I can also go up into my yellow slider. Again, the greens are made up primarily of yellow. And if I move my yellow slider over, let's go all the way. Again, you can see that I can really turn this into an electric lime, which we're not going to do, but we're going to dial back on that edit just a little bit as well. Let's come in right around the same, call it 18 points. And that's really going to start to provide some separation between my green tones and my yellow tones. All right, so as you can see, in just a few quick edits, we didn't do anything special here. We just made a few creative adjustments and honestly allowed Lightroom to do all of the heavy lifting. So let's go back up. Now that we've made all of these micro adjustments, I do feel like we can probably go back in and adjust a couple of our large format edits as well. Let's go up to 0.45, so make that ever so slightly brighter. And come down a tad on my shadows, come down a tad on my blacks, go back up on my whites. Let's drop into our tone curve and increase these a little bit because I feel like the scene is still just a tiny little bit flat and we can punch a tad more contrast in here. So let's make these numbers a little bit bigger. Let's go up, call it 10 on our highlights, 8 on our lights, -6 on our darks, and -8 on our shadows. And that should punch just enough contrast into that scene that's really going to make these trees pop out. All right, so let's hit the F key to get a kind of a preview of what we've just created. And as you can see, in just a few short steps with very minimal brain damage, we've made a really beautiful image. This is this surreal misty aspen forest. It started off as 20 unique raw files, and again, in just a few minutes, we were able to whittle those down into 4 really nice looking raw files. We combined those using Lightroom's powerful photo merge tools, and then after that, with just a few quick edits in our development module, we have what I've considered to be a very beautiful finished product. So no Photoshop necessary in this image. We were definitely able to accomplish a lot in a very short time. So hopefully this expedited lesson will help you be able to select which images in the future are going to be right for this very, very quick workflow. Not every single image in your portfolio is going to come together this quickly and easily, but there are a few little gems out there that you can get through nice and easy. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you had fun, and we will see you in the next lesson.